The ring arrived on a rainy Thursday in March. Lillian came through the door holding her hand in front of her like a lantern, the diamond throwing small cold sparks across the hallway wallpaper. I was folding laundry at the kitchen table, the same table where she once did spelling homework while I stirred cocoa. I set the towel down, opened my arms, and she stepped into them for exactly one heartbeat. Then she stepped back and the air between us changed temperature. His name was Preston. Old timber money, new entitlement. His mother wore navy silk and pearls the size of tears and spoke of the family compound before she ever asked if I needed help with the tea tray. That evening we sat in the living room that still smelled faintly of the pine candles we lit every Christmas since Lillian was 3. She spread photographs across the coffee table, a lakeside estate with stone terraces, a glass pavilion for dinner, a mahogany banquet table long enough for 30 that belonged to Preston's great-grandfather. I touched one photograph gently. "Will there be room for grandmother's table?" I asked. Lillian laughed the way you laugh at a child who is asked to bring a teddy bear to the opera. "Mom, that old thing? We're going modern rustic. The venue already has everything." I poured tea no one drank. I watched her fingers trace the glossy images and felt the first small shift, like furniture being moved while you were out of the room. The weeks that followed were quiet rearrangements. My name disappeared from the save-the-date emails. Phone calls returned later and later. Dinners cancelled because Preston's mother needs to approve the linens. I told myself it was normal. Brides get swallowed by seating charts and string quartets. Mothers learn to stand farther back. That is the silent agreement we sign the day they are born. One Sunday in April she came alone. She sat on the edge of the sofa, knees together, hands folded the way she used to when she had broken my favorite teacup. "Mom," she said, looking at the carpet instead of me, "Preston's family is traditional. They feel the wedding should reflect their history." I waited. The grandfather clock ticked the way it had through every hard conversation we ever had. She finally met my eyes. "I think it would be easier if you let us handle everything. You've done so much already." I remember the taste of iron in my mouth. I remember smiling the small, harmless smile widows perfect over years of practice. "Of course, darling," I said. And the furniture in my heart moved another inch. May smelled of lilacs and endings. The wedding invitations arrived in heavy cream envelopes addressed only to Mrs. Eleanor Whitcomb, no and family, though her father had been dead 19 years. I laid the envelope on the kitchen table beside the salt shaker and stared at it until the gold lettering blurred. The planner's name was Marlowe. She had telephoned me in April full of warmth and questions about Lillian's favorite childhood flowers, the song we danced to at her graduation party. Then, after Lillian's Sunday visit, the warmth cooled. Emails went unanswered. When I finally reached her, her voice was polite glass. "Oh, Mrs. Whitcomb, Lillian has asked that all decisions flow through her now. You understand." I understood. I began noticing the small erasures. The florist who once left voicemails saying your daughter adores peonies now said the bride has chosen all-white orchids. The calligrapher sent proofs addressed only to Lillian and Preston. My name had been quietly lifted from every contract I had quietly paid. One warm afternoon I drove to the bridal boutique unannounced. Lillian stood on a platform drowning in French lace while Preston's mother adjusted the train like a general arranging troops. They did not hear the bell at first. I stood in the doorway watching my daughter become someone else's centerpiece. When she saw my reflection, her smile faltered for half a heartbeat. Then it returned, brighter, brittle. "Mom, we're in the middle of alterations." Preston's mother did not turn around. I said I only wanted to see how beautiful she looked. Lillian sighed the way you sigh at a neighbor who has arrived at the wrong time. Marlowe appeared and gently took my elbow. Perhaps another day, Mrs. Whitcomb. The schedule is very tight. I let her lead me out. The bell above the door sounded thinner leaving than it had entering. That night I sat in the dark dining room with the invitation in my lap. I ran my thumb over the raised lettering that spelled my name in such small script and felt the years of bedtime stories and fevers and college tuition fold themselves into a very cold, very small place inside my chest. I made tea I did not taste. I looked at the long mahogany table that had come from my grandmother's house in 1928, scars from children's knives, rings from decades of coffee cups, the faint outline of my father's pipe. And somewhere between the second and third scar I stopped waiting to be invited back to my own life. June brought heat that pressed against the windows like an uninvited guest. One evening I went to the attic to find the box of Lillian's baby clothes I had promised the shower guests could see. Behind the cedar chest, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with twine gone soft with age, lay the leather portfolio my father gave me the week he died. I carried it downstairs and laid it on grandmother's mahogany table beneath the chandelier that had watched 5 generations eat Sunday dinner. The brass clasps opened with a sigh, as though they had been holding their breath since 1987. Inside were deeds folded like love letters. The house we lived in. The mountain cabin. And at the very bottom, the original hand-inked deed to the lakeside estate where Lillian's wedding would be held, signed in 1894 by my great-grandfather in ink that still looked wet. The land had never left our line. The venue company leased it from a trust that carried only my name. The mahogany banquet table they planned to seat 30 real family members at had been built from trees felled on that very property in 1901. At the back of the portfolio lay a letter in my father's careful handwriting, dated the night before his stroke. My dearest Eleanor, if you are reading this, someone has forgotten that blood is not the only thing that makes family. Everything here is yours alone. The table, the land, the lake, all of it. Let them use it while they remember kindness. Take it back when they forget. Love, Dad. I read until moonlight moved across the table and laid silver on the scars. Then I read again by lamplight, tracing each boundary line with a finger that no longer shook. I closed the portfolio, laid my palm on the cool mahogany, and felt the house settle around me like an old dog that has finally heard its name called. That night I began moving money and documents the way moonlight moves across water, slowly, silently, leaving no trace until morning. I kept the original deed on the dining table beneath a crystal vase of white roses that opened and closed with no one to see. Some nights I walked the long hallway touching the walls my father paneled himself. I laid my hand on the table's edge and remembered every Thanksgiving, every birthday, every quiet evening when Lillian fell asleep with her head on my arm. The wood was warm, as though it remembered too. I wore the small brass key from the portfolio on a ribbon beneath my blouse. It rested against my heart like a second, steadier heartbeat. And every morning I polished the table with lemon oil until it glowed the color of forgiven things. I was no longer waiting. I was simply preparing the room for the moment it would remember whose table it had always been. July arrived heavy and golden. I rose early, made coffee I barely tasted, and opened the dining room doors wide so the breeze could move across grandmother's table like a blessing. Each morning I laid the original deed in the center, weighted with the same crystal vase that had held my wedding roses in 1979. I traced the ink boundaries with one finger and memorized every survey marker, every cedar that had stood when my great-grandfather signed his name. I telephoned the venue company from the library on Tuesdays when Lillian thought I was at the senior center. I used the soft, slightly confused voice of a widow who just wants to be sure everything is in order. They told me everything: final payment dates, cancellation clauses, the exact weight of the mahogany table they had leased from the estate for the head table, 462 pounds of heart pine in memory. I wrote the numbers in a small leather journal bound in green, the color of the lake in summer. Page by page the journal filled with quiet thunder. At night I moved money the way starlight moves, slowly, steadily, unseen. Never enough to raise an alarm, always enough to matter when the final candle was snuffed. By August the trust held $9,140,000 resting in places Preston's family would need lifetimes to find. Lillian came once in September. She swept in wearing linen and new certainty, carrying seating charts and place cards printed in gold. She spread everything across grandmother's table without asking. I poured tea she did not drink. She looked up at one point and noticed the deed beneath the vase. Her smile thinned. "Mom, why is that old thing out?" "It's cluttering the photographs." I stirred my tea once, twice. "Just remembering," I said. She laughed the way you laugh at a child who keeps treasures in a shoebox. Then she gathered her papers and left without noticing the table had been polished to a mirror that reflected only me. That evening I stood before the long mirror in the hallway and practiced the small, pleasant smile that made lawyers and venue managers tell me their secrets. I practiced walking the length of the dining room in the navy silk dress I would wear the next day. I practiced carrying the framed deed wrapped in tissue the way I once carried Lillian's birthday cakes, steady, proud, unbroken. October came cool and clear. The lake turned the color of steel under early frost. Some evenings I sat at the table with tea that steamed only for me and listened to the wood speak in small creaks and sighs. It sounded like my father's voice saying, "Wait for the right moment, Ellie." I was ready. Not angry. Simply ready the way sunrise is ready long before the first light touches the water. The rehearsal dinner was held on the stone terrace of the lake house, the very terrace my great-grandfather had laid with his own hands in 1903. Lanterns glowed in the trees. White linens fluttered like surrender flags. 200 guests in silk and linen laughed over champagne that had cost more than most monthly salaries. I arrived in my navy silk dress, pearls at my throat, the small framed deed wrapped in tissue resting inside a cream leather satchel at my side. No one noticed the weight. Lillian floated among the tables, radiant, already half someone else's bride. Preston's mother introduced her as our daughter now. Each time the phrase was repeated, I felt the terrace stones shift beneath my feet. They had set a small table for me near the kitchen doors, round, meant for 8, already crowded with distant cousins who barely knew my name. I took my seat without comment. I folded my hands in my lap and waited. When the toasts began, Lillian stood at the long mahogany head table that had been carried down from the great hall for the occasion. She raised her glass, eyes shining with candlelight and certainty. "Tomorrow," she said, voice clear across the water, "only real family sits at this table." The laughter was soft, approving. Preston's mother beamed. Glasses chimed. No one looked toward the little round table near the kitchen. I felt the words settle on my shoulders like cold lake mist. I did not flinch. I simply reached into the satchel, touched the edge of the framed deed, and felt the wood of the table beneath my palm. Remember whose daughter I truly was. Later, when the moon laid a silver path across the water, I walked the terrace alone. I laid my hand on the mahogany and felt every scar, every ring, every Thanksgiving where Lillian once fell asleep with her head on my arm. The table was warm, as though it had been waiting for this night as long as I had. I went home before the dessert course. I left the navy dress hanging in the moonlight and took the framed deed to bed with me. I laid it on the pillow beside me the way I once laid Lillian's stuffed bear when nightmares came. I slept without dreaming. The words "real family" still rang in my ears, but they no longer hurt. They sounded like a door closing on a room I no longer needed to keep warm. The wedding morning came in pale gold and perfect stillness. I rose before the birds, made coffee I did not drink, and laid the framed deed on grandmother's table one last time. The glass caught the first light and threw it across the walls like quiet laughter. I wrapped it in heavy cream paper, tied it with navy ribbon the color of the lake at twilight, and placed a single white rose on top, the last bloom from the bush my father planted the year Lillian was born. I carried the package downstairs, set it on the passenger seat of the car, and drove the winding road to the lake house without hurry. The estate was already breathing with preparation. White tents billowed. Florists carried armfuls of roses that would die by evening. I walked through it all unnoticed, an older woman in navy silk carrying a gift no one expected. Inside the great hall the mahogany table waited, polished to a mirror, set for 30 with gold-rimmed plates and place cards written in Lillian's careful hand. Her name card and Preston's sat in the exact center, raised on small silver stands like thrones. I stepped forward. No one stopped me. They were too busy adjusting veils and boutonnieres. I laid the cream package gently where Lillian's place card had been, removed her card, and set it face down at the far end beside an empty chair. Then I took my seat at the very center of the table, folded my hands, and waited. Guests began drifting in. Conversations faltered. Preston's mother saw me first. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. She hurried forward, pearls swinging like pendulums. "Eleanor, there's been a mistake. That seat is for the bride." I smiled the small, pleasant smile I had practiced for months. "No mistake," I said quietly. I unwrapped the ribbon. I lifted the frame so the morning light fell full on the deed dated 1894, the ink still dark, my great-grandfather's signature bold beneath the seal. Preston arrived next. He read the deed over his mother's shoulder and the color left his face the way sunlight leaves a room when the door closes. Lillian appeared at the arch in clouds of lace, veil floating like a question mark. She saw me seated at her place. She saw the deed. She saw 200 guests reading the brass plate at the bottom that said, "Property of Eleanor Whitcomb and her heirs, 1894, present." The string quartet began the processional and stopped mid-note. I rose slowly. The navy silk rustled once, like a small, dignified flag. I lifted the deed so every eye could follow. "This table," I said, voice carrying without effort in the sudden hush, "was built from trees felled on this land the year my grandmother was married. It has never left our blood. The land beneath your feet has never left our trust. You leased both from me for one evening. The lease ended at sunrise." I turned the frame so they could read the final line my father added in 1987, "Use granted only while kindness is returned." Lillian's bouquet slipped from her fingers and struck the stone floor with a soft, expensive thud. White petals scattered like small, broken apologies. I laid the deed in the center of the table, exactly where 30 place settings had waited for real family. Then I stepped back. "The wedding may continue," I said gently. "But not at this table." Workers appeared as if from the mist, quiet men I had telephoned at dawn. They lifted the mahogany table, steady and reverent, and carried it out through the French doors toward the waiting van. Guests parted like water. No one spoke. Lillian stood frozen in her lace, veil trembling in the small wind that followed the table's leaving. I met her eyes across the widening space. I did not smile. I simply inclined my head the way women do when the past has finally been set right. I walked out beneath the rose arbor my great-grandfather planted for his bride. The table followed me down the gravel path, carried by hands that understood what real family truly meant. Behind me the pavilion stood empty of its heart. Ahead of me the lake waited, calm and unchanged, reflecting a sky that had belonged to my people long before any of them arrived. I did not look back. There was nothing left there that still carried my name. They moved the ceremony to the lawn and used folding tables draped in hurried linen. The photographs show a beautiful bride, but everyone remembers the empty space where the mahogany should have been. Lillian came to the house one November afternoon when the lake had turned the color of steel. She stood on the porch in boots and the same coat she wore at 17 and asked if the table was in the dining room. I made tea. We sat at it together for the first time in years. She traced the scars with one finger and cried without sound. I passed tissues the way I once passed her crayons. When the cup was empty, she whispered, "I didn't know it was yours." I looked at her for a long, steady moment. "You knew whose daughter I was," I said. "That should have been enough." She left without the coat. I hung it in the closet beside the navy dress that now lives in light instead of shadow. Some evenings I walk the lake path at dusk. The table waits in the great hall again, polished and patient, reflecting candlelight the way it did when my grandmother was young. I sit at the head with tea that steams only for me and listen to the water speak in small, forgiving waves. People ask if I am lonely. I tell them loneliness is a house where no one moves the furniture without asking. It is surprisingly peaceful. The last laugh is never loud. It is the soft creak of old wood settling into its rightful place. It is the quiet closing of French doors on a day that belonged to strangers. It is an old woman seated at the table her blood paid for, knowing every scar still carries her name whether anyone speaks it or not. If this story rested somewhere gentle inside you tonight, stay a while longer. The kettle is warm, the lake is quiet, and there are many more evenings when a woman remembers she was always the foundation, never the decoration. You are safe here. You are seen. And that, my dear, is enough.